I'm Scott Allen Miller, and this is my life living in León, Nicaragua. As a world traveler who's been on the go for about 15 years continuously and has a lot of experience traveling around the world before that, before it became a core part of my life, something that we're used to every day is border runs. We talk about this on a regular basis. We talk about how you should consider it and all kinds of things about life here in Nicaragua, and it struck me when someone asked me today, what is a border run? And it occurred to me that for a lot of people, border runs are a foreign concept, no pun intended, or they are something they are simply not that used to, and there may be implications that are just not well understood. And this may be contributing to why so many people want to avoid them, even though so many people who are familiar with them desire them. And so I want to go into exactly what a border run is, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that applies to here in this region. But I really want to have just the framework setting conversation of what exactly a border run is so that you can apply this to your world travels wherever you're going to go and understand how this may apply to whatever situation you're going to be in. So we're going to be talking about what is a border run right after that bump. Let's jump straight in. A border run. We assume this applies to people who are on tourist or similar visas, non-residency visa types when visiting a country. And this applies to just about anyone on a normal vacation. Now, normal vacations are so fast that you don't talk about border runs. But let's say you're visiting any given country. You're going to stay there for the maximum amount of time that is allowed as a tourist. And this could apply to other automatic visas, things that are just granted to you that you don't have to apply for ahead of time and so forth. So this is very normal for a great number of travelers. Maybe an American visiting Mexico for a vacation in Cancun, or a Canadian who is heading off to Thailand. You go for a vacation, and of course, we all think, well, I can go for a week, I can go for 2 weeks, I can stay for a month. You don't have to think about it. But what happens when you want to stay for 3 months? Well, in many of these countries, you're only given between 30 and 90 days. A few of them will give you 180 days. Very rarely, someplace like Albania is very likely to give you a year, but getting more than a year gets really unlikely in any sense. I don't know any country that's going to give you more time than that without doing some additional paperwork. But commonly, we see 30, 90, and a few outliers at 180 days is what you get as a typical tourist coming from many popular source locations, United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, those kinds of countries. And others definitely have this, right? And you're going to a country and you decide to stay long term, and you're going to be there longer than is allowed. Well, normally there's a few processes that you can follow. Of course, the most obvious process is simply leaving. Your time is up, it's time to go. That is obviously quite acceptable. A really common process for someone who decides this is where I want to be. I've been on vacation for 30 days, 90 days. I absolutely love it. Let's file some paperwork and see if the government will grant us residency so we can stay maybe for a few years or maybe forever, or maybe start a process of deciding, give yourself 5 years and then maybe be able to extend. That's a very common thing. In many countries, what you're able to do, and certainly not all, this is not an assumption, but it is a very common thing that you are allowed to exit the country and then re-enter again as if you had never left. You are able to exit the country, go over a hard border into another country, and then return and come back and get a new 30, 90, 180 days, whatever it is that they grant. This is referred to as a border run, stepping over a border, resetting your situation, doing the acceptable thing, leaving the country, and then requesting entry once again. Now, in some places, this is very simple, and in some places, this is very hard or not allowed. So you can't do this just anywhere, but the concept is very simple. If a country gives you, we're just going to assume 90 days when you come into that country. So we're going to use Thailand as an example. If you're going to Thailand, you generally get 90 days as a tourist coming from, we'll say, the United States. You fly to Thailand, you spend your 90 days, you're having such a good time, you decide you'd like to stay longer. You don't think you want to live there, you're not going to go through the effort of applying for residency or anything like that. So you simply cross the border into a neighboring country. Maybe you go into Laos, and maybe you go get lunch, and then you head back to Thailand. When you return to Thailand, under normal circumstances, you're going to enter, and they're going to give you 90 days. You have been somewhere else outside the country. If you were to do this over a long period of time, meaning you come from the United States, you go to Thailand, you give it 89 days, you decide, well, my vacation's over, you go back home, you go back to work, and then next year you come back and do the same thing again. You wouldn't think about the fact at all that you had been there previously and that you could come back. The thing that catches people off guard is often that you step out and step right back in again, often just minutes later. And in some cases, you don't even have to do the full step out. People will do the paperwork for you. That's a funny situation in a few countries. That's not to be expected, but it does happen, that you're given another 90 days or another 180 days. Right? This is a surprise thing. When you start doing it that fast, people think that's not available, but many countries are happy to allow you to do that. And we can go into great detail as to why that generally works, why those countries allow it, how that mechanism works for them, why they're willing to do that, and so forth. We've talked about that in other videos. We won't dig into the logic of why countries want to do it. Just if that's something of interest, you can go see those other videos. But at this particular juncture, just trust me that it does logically make sense for these countries. This is not a loophole. They are very aware that you are doing it, and they know how it works. It does make sense for certain countries. So this is a process of leaving the country that you are in on one of these temporary visas, temporary automatic visas, going over what we call a hard border, also defined as a visa border. We'll talk about that in a minute. Going into another country for some amount of time, generally minutes. It could be hours. Some places require a few days, like 72 hours, and then returning. If you go out for a long period of time, we don't consider it a border run. We consider it living in another country and then returning when you're allowed to. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. But those are the definitions, really, that we use universally. It's when you are staying in one country on an automatic visa, you cross a hard/visa border into another country, and then return to get another automatic visa for that first country. Okay, so what are some practical approaches and implications and things that happen with this around the world so that you understand what real-world scenarios often look like? So in many countries, you have a problem of having the availability of soft borders. What does this mean? We have to say this because much of the world has border zones where there is a hard visa border shared by multiple countries. The most famous one in the world is the European Union, the EU zone, also known as the Schengen zone, because the treaty was signed in Schengen. And that zone has many really famous countries in it, such as Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so forth. If you move between France and Germany and Italy, you can go over those borders all day, and at no point are you able to reset your visa, another thing that we refer to with border runs. The purpose of a border run is to reset your visa. Really, it's to get a fresh visa. And I know a lot of people say, well, I don't get a visa, I don't have a stamp. Yes, we refer to that automatic tourist approval as a tourist visa, even if it's not stamped in your passport. Yes, technically it has to be stamped in your passport to really be a visa, but we all use that term, accept it. And now e-visas aren't really visas, right? Like, it's a visa, accept it. So you go between these countries, you're not getting a new visa. They don't even track that you're moving between those countries, or at least not officially. You're simply going over borders that you never even notice. There's just a sign, welcome to France, welcome to Germany, and so forth. It's just like driving between states in the United States. There's really no controls between them. And in some cases, the US states actually have more controls than many of the European states. So in some ways, the United States is multiple countries within a shared border and defense zone. It's slightly different than the EU, but there's a good argument that both of them are multiple countries within a shared border zone with just different laws internally, one being a federal and one being a confederacy system. But the differences are minor in many cases, especially as a traveler. So when you're traveling to the majority of Europe, the Schengen zone, you see it as going to the Schengen. We refer to it as going into and out of the Schengen, not into and out of France. When you're doing your Instagram post, of course, you're doing France, Germany, and so forth. But when you're dealing with travel logistics, you think of it as going in and out of the Schengen, and that is where you enter the Schengen zone, you exit the Schengen zone. And the Schengen, for many of us, gives us 90 days. However, they use a system known as the 90 in, 90 out. You can go in for 90 days, but you have to then be out for 90 days before you can re-enter again. After the 90 days out, you're able to re-enter again automatically for another 90. You don't have to go through any special paperwork other than the pre-approval visa that the EU now requires across the board. But it's standard. You're not doing an extra step because of your second entry after you have that 90 out. Technically, it's 90 days in with at least 90 days out with any rolling 180-day period. So we're not going to go into the really detailed logistics of how you can manipulate those time periods within the Schengen. There is some complexity to that, and I lived in the Schengen for a long time. So there's ways to get maximum advantage out of that, but it's essentially 90 days in, 90 days out. And as long as you're doing that, you're okay. Here in Central America, we have a border zone known as the CA4, the Central American 4. There are 4 countries here. We all share a hard visa border. That border to the south is at Costa Rica. To the north, it's at Belize and at Mexico. Every country in between there is within a single border. So if you're crossing from Costa Rica into Nicaragua, you cross the visa border. If you cross from Mexico into Guatemala or into Belize, from Mexico into Guatemala or from Belize into Guatemala, you are crossing a hard visa border. And once you're inside Guatemala or Nicaragua, moving between all the countries within the CA4, you're not actually crossing a hard border. There are border checks. They are security checkpoints. They may look at your passport. You expect that they will. They may look at your luggage and such. They may check a bunch of things, but they are security checkpoints. They may optionally stamp your passport. They are allowed to do so. They're not required to do so. At no point do you have to check in and out of those countries by law because you're within your border. Everything is already inside. So it's a very different situation than moving between, say, Nicaragua and Costa Rica, where it's a full border. So if you are within the CA4 and you have a tourist visa for 90 days within that zone and you want to do a border run, you can't move between those countries, just like you can't move between France and Germany to reset your Schengen visa. You have to move between Nicaragua and Costa Rica or between Guatemala and Mexico, and then in this situation, you're able to return immediately. The CA4 visa zone does not require 90 in, 90 out. They give you 90 days automatically when you come in. That is the standard. And to get it again, you simply move to the country outside. And it could be any country. It doesn't have to be a bordering one. You could fly to Panama. You could fly to France and reset your visa. Come back the same day, and you have another 90 days automatically. So this region is famous for its border runs, and most of Latin America uses what we call the border run system. They allow you to simply step out and step back in for, in some cases, they do require you to be out by up to 3 days. But in most cases throughout Latin America, you simply step out and come right back in, and you get another 90 days or 180 days, whatever that country is going to give you, pretty commonly. In Southeast Asia, they have the same system. Border runs are very, very common there, and there, sometimes you even get the luxury of being able to send someone with your passport over the border. They act as if you left the country, and then they come back in with your passport, and you don't have to physically leave the country that you started in, which sounds pretty scary, but it's a very standard process, and people do it all the time. So much of Southeast Asia also being a low-cost zone with a lot of expats desiring to live there in a similar mode to what we have here in Central America and much of Latin America, they behave very similarly, whereas Europe is a very different animal, and they behave differently based on their needs. They're a much larger tourist zone, much smaller expat zone. So they balance things differently in different regions of the world. It all depends on how your destination country needs to tune things to make things best for them. So that's the concept of a border run. You are living in a place, you don't want to get residency, and so you simply step out and step back in again at whatever pace they require and get a new set of time within the country. This is a very simple system. It's very straightforward. It doesn't require applying for anything. It doesn't require a bunch of paperwork. It doesn't require waiting for approval and so forth. So a lot of people desire it because it's incredibly flexible. If you are living in, we'll just use Nicaragua where I am as an example, you decide you want to stay here and you're here for 90 days. And yes, you can extend. You can get 180 days without leaving the country. But for some people, you're only doing it once. Why go through that process when you can just visit Costa Rica for the weekend, enjoy Costa Rica, and then come right back and get another 90 days. If you are a footloose and fancy-free traveler, you may say to yourself, you know what, I really like Nicaragua, I'm going to extend, and then maybe you do it again, and you end up staying for a year, maybe a year and a half. But you're not intending to actually make a life here. You're not going to buy a house. You're not going to buy a car. You're not going to really make a life here. You're just really enjoying the time that you're here. You are a tourist, but for a very long, extended period of time. At the end of a year and a half, Nicaragua doesn't say anything to you. You're not looking for residency. You're not trying to extend again. You simply say, you know, I'm ready to move on to the next country. Where do I want to go next? You decide Panama sounds great. So you move on to Panama, and they give you 180 days. You're an American. You automatically get that 6 months. And so you do Panama for half a year. And then you say, you know what? I'm thinking about moving on to someplace new. So you go down and you apply and you get into Bolivia. You go down and live in Bolivia for a while. Maybe you extend there a few times and put in a year or two. By simply using border run systems over a period of time, you can end up moving around the world and spending a lot of time in most of the countries in the world, being able to live more or less as long as you want in each place, as long as you aren't pushing into that barrier of really settling down and becoming a resident. There are a few regions like Europe where this is very difficult. And of course, China as well. Quite difficult. You can't get very much time in China, and you need to go out for a period of time and reapply. Like, it's just not easy to simply step back in. But you could apply for a work visa or something, of course, but that's getting into some form of residency, some more formal process. This is about being able to move around much of the world very, very simply. So a lot of travelers use border run systems either all the time or occasionally in order to make their world travels as simple as possible while being able to have long periods of stay within any given country. And sometimes they end up in a gray area where, you live in Nicaragua for 90 days, then you go to Costa Rica for 2 weeks, and then you come back because you just feel like coming back. Is that a border run? Maybe, maybe not. We generally wouldn't consider that a border run. We would consider that having left, taken a vacation, and returning, but it does end up resetting things. And for many of us who have done border runs in the past, I'm not on the system now, you may end up spending a lot of time in a country. Again, I live in Nicaragua, but for much of the time that I was on the border run system, I would work or travel to other countries, sometimes pretty far away, and when I would return, I would automatically get a new visa, because that's what happens when you leave a country like that. I wasn't officially living in Nicaragua, and so when I would go to Bolivia for work for a few weeks and come back, it was just like I had been in Bolivia on part of my travels. Now I'm on Nicaragua again for part of my travels, so my new visa totally makes sense. It's not really considered a border run, but it resets your visa so you can avoid a border run quite naturally. Because of those things, the border run system is very popular with a lot of travelers, because in many cases, it's not even something you have to worry about. It's just a tool in your tool set that you're able to use in a great number of great locations in order to be able to do things. An alternative non-residency process that you might use in different parts of the world, we mentioned the Schengen zone in Europe, and having lived there for a very long time, this is something that's very popular. What we would do there is live for 90 days, the Schengen visa limit within the Schengen zone, and then move to a neighboring region that had a similar rule but was not the Schengen. So back at the time that we lived there, countries like Romania and Ukraine were outside of the EU, outside of the Schengen. Romania was inside the EU at the time, but outside the Schengen. So you could go live in Romania, you could live in Bulgaria, you could live in Albania, Croatia. Now, many of these have changed. Many of these have moved into the Schengen. They're working in that direction. But at the time, you got 90 days in the Schengen, and then you get 90 days in Romania, 90 days in the Schengen, 90 days in Bulgaria, and you could be half the year inside the Schengen and half the year sitting just outside the Schengen in a very similar region without any problem at all, and just very simple. Now, it's not considered border runs because you're doing half and half, and obviously the impact on your life is very different. You're not settled into one place, you have to be settled into two places or so forth. But if you want to move around and you're looking at longer stays, this is a very popular system, and people who want to get a lot of time in Europe but don't want to go through residency or citizenship processes, this is a way to get a lot of time in Europe without making a huge commitment. And Europe is generally quite hard to move into, so many people opt for this process. And it makes sense for Europe to do this because it allows them to have higher cost tourist living and bring in more revenue from those people without worrying about them really becoming settled and starting to change Europe. And every 90 days, they have options. If they're having a problem with tourists, they can put in limits or change fees or so forth, and reevaluate what they're doing. So it keeps them very flexible while allowing you to stay very flexible. So that is what a border run is. Before we get into specifics about here in Nicaragua doing border runs, let's talk about a little bit of our housekeeping. Anything you need, just look in our show notes. We have ways to contact me. We have our social media. And of course, if you'd like to help support the show, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. And you can either join our community there, $6 a month, and that does a ton to support us, or just buy a coffee or a number of coffees. It really makes a big difference. It is very expensive to make this show. There's also a join button to join on the YouTube channel as well. In either case, if you do join, make sure you send me a note. We have a private group that will put you into, and you get into the discussions about the direction of the show and feedback and moderation, all kinds of stuff. It's not a huge thing, but it is a pretty cool little group. Also, links to get into our WhatsApp Expats of Nicaragua group, how to send in a video of yourself so you can ask questions or leave comments on the show. All of that is in there. Plus, get down in the comments, say hello, whatever, right? Connect with us. We love connecting with you guys. We have nothing that we sell, not even swag, although we're going to get to that someday. I promise. I get a lot of questions about that, and I just never get to it. I will someday get that figured out. But without further ado, okay, here in Nicaragua. What are border runs here? Because this comes up because this is a channel that does focus on Nicaragua quite a bit, and this is a region known for its border runs. Not just Nicaragua proper, but the entire Central American region is very well known for using border runs as a pretty regular part of its process. Way more people than are here in Nicaragua are living in Costa Rica, and border runs are a major part of Costa Rican life. Now, Costa Rica has many more tourists, is a smaller country, and has two hard borders that are easily accessible, one into Panama, one into Nicaragua, and so there's a lot of people who do border runs in Costa Rica because it's just so much more convenient than in many other countries. They're kind of perfectly situated for that. But here in Nicaragua, we get much of the same situation. And in all these countries, you generally get 90 days automatic. Some cases do give you 180, and those that don't give you 180 automatically generally give you extension options to get up to 180 without leaving the country. Here in Nicaragua, we are like that. It is 90 days automatic in most cases when you cross into the country, airport, at a hard border, at a ground border, whatever, and then you can do 30-day extensions 3 times to get you up to a total of 180 days before you have to do a border run or get residency within that time, of course. People getting residency generally are required to do at least one, if not many, border runs. Border runs are not an alternative to the residency process. They are simply a part of the general process. Everything here in Nicaragua assumes you will move into the country, that you will do at least one border run, and that any residency you decide to do is something you will decide to do and start from within the country. Don't think it's something you need to heavily research or in any way talk to someone about or start or prepare for abroad. Of course, getting your birth certificates and all that kind of stuff and getting them at apostille, sure, that's the kind of stuff you want to prepare ahead of time for anywhere. Just be flexible. But in general, you don't have to contact Nicaragua or begin the process or have anything in place before you move here. That is not how Nicaragua works. It's a way simpler country, but it's a little bit confusing because not that many places make it that easy, and so people are certain that it must be harder than it is. So if you are here and you want to do a border run, you can go down to Costa Rica and do the exact opposite of what Costa Ricans do. They come up to Nicaragua, we go down to Costa Rica, but we're both doing the same thing, just traveling to the border, stepping over the border, getting stamped into the alternative country. So Nicaraguans check out of Nicaragua, they stamp into Costa Rica, they immediately turn around, stamp out of Costa Rica, and back into Nicaragua, and restart that 90/180 days. And Costa Ricans do the same thing. They check out of Costa Rica, stamp into Nicaragua, turn right around, leave Nicaragua, stamp into Costa Rica, and start their next 180 days. So it's a very similar process. Now, what if you don't want to go to Costa Rica or you live really far from that border? A lot of people get confused here because they think they'll just go into that giant Honduran border. It's so easy to cross at Los Manos or cross at Guasaule. That must get you what you need, right? No, that does not count. Honduras shares a border zone, the CA4, with Nicaragua, as does El Salvador and Guatemala. So being within any of those countries, you're on the same visa. That 180-day total time clock is kicking down as long as you're clicking down, as long as you're within that zone. So if you want to go north and reset your visa, you want to do a border run from Nicaragua northbound, the only 2 borders that are available to you by ground are Belize, which is very difficult to do because of its incredibly few number of roads coming into the region, or Mexico, which is much easier to do, still pretty far away. We're talking very long distances. But if you're traveling throughout the region, it could work. It could be something that makes sense for you, especially if you live throughout the CA4 zone and are not spending all of your time in just one country. I like to spend a lot of time in Guatemala when the opportunity arises. So for me, it could make sense to cross into Mexico, but because I work in Belize, I'm often there, and so it resets for me automatically if I was on the border run system. I'm a resident now, so I don't have to do that. But when I was, that worked very easily for me. So Nicaraguans, or people who are staying in Nicaragua on the border run system, need to be aware that those are your only borders by ground. Of course, anywhere in the world, if you hop on a plane and fly far away to a place that's outside your border zone, you're going to reset automatically. So from here in Nicaragua, simple flights include Mexico, Panama, Cuba, the United States. These will reset your visa very simply and pretty straightforward. The thing that's misleading to many people is they think that a flight to El Salvador will reset their visa, but it does not. And a great number of flights from Nicaragua go directly to El Salvador, so it's tempting to think that that's the easy location, because it is technically 2 borders away when you're looking at a map. How could that not reset it? But it does not. It's inside the CA4, so you can't use that. And for the most part, that is all you need to know about border runs, both generally and here in Nicaragua. For countries that allow border runs, it's important to understand this is not a loophole. No country is confused and doesn't think that people are using the border to reset their visa. Every country is completely and utterly aware of this process, and they have tuned their systems to encourage it, discourage it, disallow it, and so forth, depending on what their needs are. In many cases, this is dependent upon what their borders are. Nicaragua has a border with Costa Rica. That makes it a very simple system for Nicaragua. If our border was with an enemy country that was not safe, well, they probably wouldn't allow that, or they wouldn't encourage it, or it just wouldn't be popular. But because it's Costa Rica, we have a system where both countries have a very safe neighbor and a very tourist-friendly neighbor. Even though Costa Rica is tourist-focused and Nicaragua is not tourist-focused, Nicaragua is extremely tourist-friendly. And so being able to move back and forth between the two countries makes a lot of sense. Tons of tourists in either one wants to visit the other naturally. It just makes sense. And they have a lot of shared culture and history. And the airport options in Costa Rica, for example, are very good. So many Nicaraguans or residents or border runners in Nicaragua would like to use Costa Rica either as an inbound or outbound or both airport. I do this commonly, especially if I'm flying southbound. We don't have good South American flights out of Nicaragua, but Costa Rica has great ones. So very easily we just cross the border and go use that. So in places that have really common border crossings but are not a single border zone, like the Schengen, it is common to see allowed border runs as just part of the process. They have to handle it for so many things anyway, they might as well use it for other purposes. So if you're looking at a place and you see that border runs are allowed simply by how their visas work, assume that the country is aware of that, it is allowed, and there may be some details you need to know, such as in both Costa Rica and Nicaragua, there is a limit to how often you can do it, but it's not a hard limit. They're going to look at your total behavior, and they will notify you when you cross a border, hey, maybe you need to look at residency if this is the process you're going to keep doing, or maybe you are doing border runs so infrequently, or you're doing so many other things that they're like, no, border runs are the right thing for you. Right? It is an official process. It is a promoted process. It is not anything wrong, but there is certain behaviors that would trigger that is no longer the correct process or desired process for what you're doing. But a great way to go here in Nicaragua is do the border runs, but do the extensions. The reason I like the extensions is that they force you to have a conversation with the Department of Immigration called Migración. When you go to Migración, you have the opportunity to simply have a conversation, and you can ask, or they can tell you, if your border runs feel like they're getting to be too much. Seems like you've done quite a few border runs here. You seem to be very settled in the place that you're going to be. Is this something where you're just doing this one last border run and then you plan on leaving? No harm, no foul. Great to have had you visit. Or do you plan on keep doing this for a long time? If so, maybe we should talk about a residency process that's going to be more appropriate for the lifestyle that you have. And then that is a conversation. You can begin those processes and they will tell you what you need to do. That's a great thing about this process, is that there's just a conversation to be had. And by doing that system, no one's surprised, and you can make good decisions when the time comes. So that's how things work in Nicaragua. That is what border runs are. Thank you so much for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me that coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ScottAllenMiller. Everything you need is in the show notes, including links for that. Really appreciate all the support that you guys provide and make all this possible. I have recorded this video just before I'm leaving for the United States, where I should be for a week, dealing with some logistics up there. I will be back in Nicaragua very soon, fingers crossed, with my driver's license, so that I will be able to bring you way more content from all over Nicaragua. Finally, we're getting all those things put back together so we can get some really exciting stuff. I have a potential trip to Costa Rica on the books coming up, and some interesting things. So thank you so much for joining me. As always, share on social media and tell someone about the show. Get the word out there. We need to get more people watching the show. I really appreciate it. And of course, you can support the show just by watching another episode. I will see all of you tomorrow.